Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to today's program and webinar, part of the highly acclaimed series of webinars that ACP, the Association of Contingency Planners, presents for both current and future members. For more information about ACP, visit www.acp-international.com. My name is Ed Goldberg, and it is my honor to host these webinars. My thanks to ACP's headquarters staff at ADG in Albany, and our good friends at Continuity Housing, including Michelle Lowther, for their roles as webinar experts who work behind the scenes to ensure that these webinars happen flawlessly. And a big thanks to our webinar series sponsor, Continuity Housing. Continuity Housing guarantees pre-negotiated hotel rooms at substantial savings for the critical employees of larger and mid-sized companies in order to help prevent a business disruption in the event of a crisis. They've created a patent-pending guaranteed employee housing program which secures and protects hotel rooms for critical personnel and their families if needed, while saving companies significant expense. Continuity Housing has a 100% success record with their deployments, and each member of their team has at least 10 years of experience. For information on receiving a free 30-minute consultation about your deployment housing needs, visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment in the survey that will pop up at the end of this webinar. This and previous webinars are recorded and made available on the ACP website. Please feel free to share the link to the recordings with your peers and anyone you think that might benefit from it. You'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar via email, along with any additional information on the topical content. And if you would, please help us out. If you have an idea for a webinar topic, please send it to me or to Michelle with 2 L's at continuityhousing.com. We use that to improve our programs, and we really appreciate it. And we'll be taking questions at the end, so please share them with me in the question box in your control panel throughout the presentation. Our topic today is business preparedness for pandemics and flu season. Every year, an average of 35,000 people die from simple flu in the United States. Businesses also lose a lot of productivity every winter because of the flu. We can all do a lot to prevent the spread of influenza, and moreover, many businesses should have a pandemic preparedness plan in the event of a severe pandemic. Ebola, Avian Influenza, which is still around in Asia, tuberculosis, other drug-resistant viruses, and potential threats make it so that we need to be prepared. Join us to learn how your business can be more prepared for these public health events and others like it. And our speaker today is a return to our program, and we're thrilled to have Harlan Dolgan with us. Harlan's been a business continuity professional for more than 15 years, having received his CBCP in 2003. He's the co-owner of Biodefense Network, a public health consultancy that specializes in all aspects of closed POD planning. He'll tell you about that, including recruiting businesses and other organizations to become closed points of dispensing. That's what they are. He's also co-founder of pandemicprep.org, a 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides free educational sessions on pandemic and bioterrorism preparedness in the St. Louis region, which is where Harlan is located. Harlan's been a business continuity consultant since 2009. Previously, he worked for Thomson Reuters, WellPoint, and U.S. Bank in various business continuity and disaster recovery management positions. Please join me in welcoming Harlan Dolgan. Good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction, Ed. Appreciate everyone being on the phone. We're talking about business continuity with regards to pandemic and how you prepare your businesses going forward. And the first half of the presentation will kind of set the table. This may be a refresher course for some, maybe new for others. But I thought we'd set the stage for what a pandemic is and how it's going to how it potentially could impact businesses in communities. And then the second half would be the preparedness part, how businesses as well as the community can be prepared. So first of all, I wanted to just mention the 2 other sessions that I had been part of this year. The first one on February 4th was talking about closed points of dispensing or closed pods. It's bioterrorism preparedness. They're with an anthrax or tularemia or bubonic plague scenario. where your business could partner with your local health department, and you could get medication from the health department that would service your employees' families, any contractors or tenants you had, anybody that you want, basically. So that's something that you might want to consider if you're not familiar with that program. You can watch the video where the link is there. And then the second one was July 22nd, when we did a case study of closed pods in St. Louis, Dallas, and Oswego County. So if you want to look at either of those, they're on the ACP website, and you can look at them on their YouTube channel. Going forward, this session is going to talk about pandemic preparedness, specifically for businesses, flu preparedness, especially since we're going into the flu season, the seasonal flu season. And then Ebola preparedness isn't specifically mentioned. This is really a talk about pandemic flu preparedness, but doing that will also prepare you for Ebola preparedness. So I know this spring and summer, that was a big focus for a lot of people because of the Ebola outbreaks that we had and including a few of them in the United States. But fortunately, that seems to have subsided at least temporarily, and who knows if it will rear its ugly head again. So it's always good to be prepared. So first of all, a history of pandemics. 1918 was the last time that there was a really severe pandemic. In 57 and 68, those were a little worse than the normal flu season. Well, significantly worse than the normal flu season. Between 1 million and 2 million people died in 58 and in 57 and 68 because of the pandemic then. In 1918, though, that's the last time there was a really severe pandemic. 40 to 50 million people died. Some put the estimate as high as 100 million people, and we don't know because in third world countries they didn't have good record keepers, so we really don't know how many people died, but a conservative estimate is 40 to 50 million people worldwide. Over 600,000 in the United States died back in 1918. You all are probably familiar with the mild pandemic that we had in 2009. And in 2009, that was H1N1 was the designation. Some people called it the swine flu. That really hurt the pig industry unnecessarily, so it really shouldn't have been called swine flu, but it did come from pigs, and so it was called the swine flu for a time. But that was much less severe. That's not, the only reason it was less severe is because the vaccine, the virus kind of chose that path. If the virus had chosen a different path and decided to be more deadly, it would have had much more significant consequences. And we'll go into that a little bit. So first of all, seasonal influenza that we're talking about occurs every fall and winter. Something that I didn't know before I started getting involved in this is approximately 35,000 people die in the U.S. every year from seasonal influenza. It's mostly the very young and the very old that don't have good immune systems, but that's a pretty high number to be aware of. So, and then the other thing is there's a vaccine that's created. Hopefully you all will get the vaccine. This is the time it starts getting rolled out. And the vaccine is decided on around February of every year because they have to spend about 6 months manufacturing it. So in February, they're trying to guess the strains that will be prevalent this year. And most of the times they hit the mark, sometimes they don't though, which makes it a more severe flu season. So seasonal versus avian influenza. Avian influenza, you may remember if you've been doing this a while, back in 2006, there was a big concern about H5N1, and that hasn't gone away, just so you're aware. I get reports on it periodically that there are still avian influenza cases over in the Middle East. It is not something that has gone away, and I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's just something to be aware of. It's not in the media anymore. They kind of got fatigued about reporting on avian influenza, but it's still around. Not quite as viral, not killing as many people as it used to. but it is still around. And there's other candidates that might become a pandemic, like drug-resistant tuberculosis. There's the MERS-CoV, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus that I hear about quite a bit, and that does get into the news sometimes. These things are not human-to-human transmissible now, and hopefully they never will be, but there's always the possibility that they will jump into a form that is highly transmissible. Ebola, I put that on there. It's not likely that Ebola is going to be a pandemic, but it's certainly something that people are watching. And the reason why it probably won't become a pandemic is because they've gotten very good at quarantining it as soon as it does pop up. And so it is contagious from one person to another, but it's not highly contagious. So if you remember, there was the gentleman in Dallas that was in the news that actually did die. He had come over from, I believe, Sierra Leone, and he actually died at a hospital here in Dallas. And that person lived with other people while he was sick. He was actually went to the hospital, was sent home, and 3 or 4 days later came back to the hospital. He lived with other people, and those people never got Ebola. So it's not highly transmissible like influenza is. So that's the good news about Ebola. For pandemic influenza to occur, that's when a new virus mutates into a highly transmissible form, so that people can pass it along from one person to another. It occurs naturally every 30 to 40 years, and you can trace it back to the Middle Ages, to the 1400s, and even before then, where it's happened every, probably about on average 3 times per century. The death rate varies, as we've seen. 1918 was much more severe than the pandemics that have come since then. And actually, I should have taken this last part out. Before 2009, it was highly probable that a pandemic would occur within the next 10 years. I'm still not convinced. Like the 1958 and the 1967 happened very close together. And we don't know. Everybody's just guessing on when the next pandemic will occur. We know that a pandemic will occur in the future. We just don't know when. So I apologize. That should not have been in there. This is something, first of all, the quote from Yogi Berra, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. That's certainly true in this case. We don't know when it's going to happen. But this is what the World Health Organization talks about when they measure whether we're at risk for a pandemic or not. So right now, we're at pandemic alert level 3, where there's some activity, but it's not highly transmissible yet, and it's very limited human-to-human transmission. Back in 2009, we were at one point up to number 6. They had declared, I think in June or July of 2009, that we were at level 6 and that we were in a full pandemic. Okay. So why are the experts concerned? First of all, H1N1, which was the designation, and I'm not a medical person, so I don't profess to know too much about it, but through the years I've certainly heard a lot about it. H1N1 was involved both in 1918 and also in 2009. And so that's interesting because in 2009 it wasn't very deadly, but in 2018 it was extremely deadly. So that's just something through the years we had acclimated ourselves to the H1N1, and it didn't mutate enough to be very deadly. And that's about as far as my medical expertise will take me. The next pandemic, and these were projections back in 2006, 2007, that if we have a severe pandemic similar to 1918, which killed 40 to 50 million people, because of the population increases, we would expect that it would kill 100 to 600 million people worldwide, with millions in the United States. In 1918, it killed about 650,000 people in the U.S. we would expect, because of our increases in population, that it would be much more significant. Presently, there's no vaccine effective against the next pandemic. That's one interesting thing. In the last 50 years, we have not gotten better at providing, at producing vaccines. We're still producing vaccines by growing cultures and eggs, something that has been happening for the last 50, 60 years. So there is a lot of vaccine development that hopefully will reduce the 4 to 6 months that it takes to produce a vaccine today. And hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, some of those, we'll have some breakthroughs and vaccines will be able to be produced through synthetic means much quicker than growing cultures in chicken eggs now. But we're not there yet. And so even though you think we're so much more technologically advanced today than we were back in 1918, the truth is not really that much when it comes to a virus. A virus still could beat us because it keeps mutating. That's a virus's job. It keeps mutating. It's the only job it does, and it does it very efficiently. So that's why every year they have to have a new vaccine, guessing based on what the viruses are going to do, 6 months from then. So anyway, that's just something to take into account, that if the virus, I said it once before, if the virus had decided to turn deadly, there's not a lot that we could have done to prevent it. Tamiflu, influenza, and other drugs maybe can reduce the severity, but there still would be, if it was a deadly virus, there would still be a lot of deaths. So more about why we were concerned, because humans can carry and transmit influenza virus just like they can the seasonal flu for 1 to 2 days before becoming sick themselves. Containment is nearly impossible because of that first fact, and the economic impact worldwide would be trillions of dollars. The picture on the right is an army barracks during 1918 that was turned into basically a medical hospital because of the heavy need. And most of those people are soldiers probably that are in that picture, because the army was hit very heavily back in 1918. Okay, so additional reasons why you should be concerned. The vaccine supplies are probably not going to catch up to demand if it's a severe pandemic, and that's what I'm assuming with this, that we're talking about billions of courses of medicine, so the technology doesn't exist today to do that quickly. The first batch of vaccine will come out 4 to 6 months after the pandemic has started, and probably supply would catch up to demand probably around 1 year into it, because for this last 2009 pandemic, which was very mild, the pandemic started in April, and there wasn't really sufficient supply until November or December, and that's when people didn't really want the medicine anymore. So if you had a severe pandemic with much higher demand, you can see the problem. The assumption is 30 to 40% of the population may become ill if it's a severe pandemic. We're talking about school closings, daycare closings that would be ordered by the government. Certain businesses might be closed. Public gatherings would be outlawed. Going to church might be outlawed. Weddings might be outlawed, that kind of thing, again, if it's a severe pandemic. Food and medicine may be scarce. And I liken this to a Hurricane Katrina type emergency, but not just in one city, but literally in all cities almost simultaneously around the world. And Contagion, if you haven't seen that movie, there were some CDC experts and some infectious disease experts trying to that were helping the writers and directors of the movie, so they could get it as realistic as possible. So I don't know, I don't want to paint the doomsday picture. Again, we don't know if there's going to be a severe pandemic in the next 50 to 100 years, but we should plan for it. And so if you haven't seen the Contagion movie, you might want to take a look at that. What this is a pandemic severity index, and we're going to go over the bottom part kind of in significant detail. But what this was the CDC's attempt there's a hurricane index, hurricane, severity 1 through severity 5. And so they wanted to create a pandemic severity index of a similar vein. And so they have severity 1 through severity 5. And they have different recommendations based on if it's a severity 1 pandemic, severity 2 or 3 pandemic, and severity 4 and 5 pandemic, 4 and 5 being the very worst. And the very worst, as you can see on the right, indicates that there would be more than a 2% mortality rate. And so with 2% mortality in the United States, that would be about 1.8 million people that would die from a pandemic if it was a pandemic severity 4 or 5. Well, I guess that's a severity 5. Severity 4 is 1% to 2%. And so you can see on the far right-hand side, you can see the number of deaths that would be anticipated based on U.S. population back in 2006, and the numbers have only grown since then. So there's different recommendations for people that are home, for people that are at school, and for people that are in the workplace. So I'll let you read through it, but we'll talk about the workplace, adult social distancing. So one of the things, if you're in the workplace during a severe pandemic, you would want to definitely decrease how much your people are interacting. So that means canceling face-to-face meetings in favor of more teleconferencing and those types of things. You would want to decrease the distance, increase the distance between people working together. So you could still have people working in an office, but maybe you'd want to skip every other cubicle or space out the desks in an appropriate way. 3 to 6 feet is the length, is the distance. So I would say make that 6 feet. So let's assume 6 feet is the distance that you should have people apart from each other. I've even heard some people had talked about having, stairwells that would be for up, so that people wouldn't have to pass in the stairwells, and then other stairwells that would be designated as down stairwells, just to make sure that people aren't, passing each other in the stairwells. If there were going to be public gatherings, corporate meetings, that type of thing, you'd want to consider postponing them or maybe having webinars rather than face-to-face meetings, those types of things. You'd want to adjust potentially people's schedules so that some people worked, let's say, a morning shift from 7 to 3, other people worked from 3 to 11, and if you needed a graveyard shift, people could work from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. So that way you've basically created 3 shifts, and that there aren't as many people in the workforce so that it's not overcrowded. So this is the CDC's recommendation, and the one interesting thing, the thing I will comment is that I never heard after the 2009 pandemic, which clearly it was a 1, but no one ever designated it as a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And I thought that was interesting because this is the CDC's own guideline, and then they chose not to actually make a designation. So that was a little puzzling. Okay. So I think I've painted a pretty bleak picture for if there was a severe pandemic, and I will say that there's a lot of things that we can do to make sure it's less severe, and that's one of the things that we're going to be going over now. So first of all, back even in 1918, where they were just kind of understanding viruses and virology, they knew enough to keep people separated back then. And so communities that responded very well, and I happen to live in St. Louis, and St. Louis was one of those communities that responded really, really well. It had a good political system that really listened to the medical community and did what it was supposed to do, which was close down all the schools, close down I think, bars and restaurants back then so that people couldn't go to saloons, and congregate. The churches were asked to not have sermons for a few weeks where it was most critical. And then you compare that with Philadelphia. Philadelphia, the story there is that they had a war bond rally that was going to be happening, and they had a breakout right before the war bond rally, and the health director wanted to cancel the event, but the mayor decided to go ahead with the event. And as a result of that, and they had hundreds of thousands of people lining the streets, all congregated pretty close together. And as a result of that, 3 days after the war bond rally, the hospitals were just overflowing in Philadelphia with sick people, and they had lots of deaths because of that. So Philadelphia actually had a death rate 5 times higher than the death rate in St. Louis. And so there are a lot of things that can be done to reduce the death rate. So that's good news. And then there have been studies about how, St. Louis and other communities that were very strict, accomplished a better death rate than some of the other communities. So also science and medicine is improving our capability to respond to these types of disasters. So I talked about, there are vaccine trials in the works that would make it much more effective and much faster to mass produce synthetic vaccine rather than the cultured vaccine that has to be grown now in chicken eggs. And awareness and preparation, is definitely our best weapons. You can see on the right, there's the picture, and it says how to avoid influenza, and it says gargle daily. Now that's back in probably around the same time as 1918 with the 1918 influenza. And obviously, they didn't know what they were doing back then. We know now that it's other things that will help with that. And I'll get to that in a few seconds, a few slides. But first, let's talk about one thing that one of the public health directors in St. Louis had created 3 slides that I'm borrowing. So to kind of explain how all of this should work. So there's the social collapse. I know I'm probably spending too much time on this first section, so I'm going to do this quickly. So the idea is that if the bell-shaped curve is the number of deaths, the idea here is and you get to a point where there's no food and the medical community isn't able to keep up and the morgue isn't able to keep up with the number of deaths, then you get to a point where social collapse, municipal service collapse and social collapse happens. And what we want to do is provide better service so that municipal service collapse doesn't happen as quickly, as well as flatten out the bell-shaped curve by doing some of the things we're talking about with social distancing and canceling schools and that kind of thing, so that you never get to a point where there is municipal service collapse or social collapse. Okay, now we're going to get into the meat of it. And so this is obviously why you're here. So one of the things that you want to do is understand at a management level, if there were a severe pandemic, you want to understand what your overall impact is going to be on key vendors, on customers, on employees. With key vendors, if you have a single vendor that provides you, a overwhelming percentage of goods that you need, you might want to consider what happens if that key vendor, whether it's a pandemic or any other reason, is not able to provide the service that they do. So you might want to think about having multiple vendors that can provide that service. If you had a 30 to 40% reduction in staff, how would you deal with that? That's one of the things. When I was at Reuters, we actually had to build a pandemic plan and assume that 50% of all of our staff was unavailable due to a pandemic. And so that's just something that you have to think about. If 30 to 40% of your staff weren't there, what would you do? One of the things that you should do is create a pandemic plan, and we talked about that on the next slide. So one of the things you want to do, highly critical, and for those of you that have been experienced in business continuity, you know this, but particularly important for a pandemic plan is to identify your critical and non-critical functions. All your buildings are there, but you potentially don't have enough people to run certain functions. So once you figure out what your critical and non-critical functions are, and so by non-critical, you might have, you might, if you're in a severe pandemic and you're running out of people, you might redirect your HR people and your audit people and other people that have jobs that are not as critical to covering customer service calls and other things that are more critical to service your customers. Not that those other functions, HR and audit and others, aren't important, but during a critical shortage of people, it's just not as important as servicing customers. You would want to identify staff that can work from home. And I actually have a slide that talks about the teleworking program. It sounds simple, but it's not really simple if you want to do it well. So we'll talk about that in a slide or two. You want to make sure that your staff knows and uses good hygiene. So on the right, there's a poster, and I've seen that quite a few different buildings. Sometimes public health buildings, sometimes office buildings. This should be readily available, and you can get it from any of there's down below, there's a number of sponsoring organizations that you can get it from. And so that's one of the things that you would want to do, is make sure that staff knows that washing hands thoroughly and frequently is still one of the best measures, and that will help you with seasonal influenza. It also helps you certainly during a pandemic, where as long as you are trying to maintain a germ-free environment, that's the best that we can do in terms of making sure we're prepared and trying to stave off a pandemic or the impact of a pandemic in our offices. Identify triggers for closing offices. So just like schools that might close, at what point would you want to be closing an office if it gets so infected, or if there are so many people that get sick at that particular office? You do want to make sure that you review your HR policies. Are people, if we're in a severe pandemic, are people going to get paid while they're ill or caring for sick family members for extended periods of time? So let's say it's beyond 2 weeks. So are you going to pay people, or are you going to just maintain your standard policies, or are there new policies that you would implement just during a pandemic period? If the building is closed, are people going to get paid? Some people may be able to work from home and some people may not be able to, so are you going to penalize the ones that can't work from home? Revise sick policies to prohibit ill people from coming to work. That's a big one, because I always call it the John Wayne syndrome. He gets shot a couple of times, but he still saves the day and gets the girl. So the question is, so a lot of people have that mentality that no matter how sick I am, I should go into work because it's my duty to go into work. But if you're sick with influenza, and that's true of seasonal influenza or a pandemic influenza, and you go into work, you're effectively infecting other people. And if you do that, that's detrimental to the workplace. So you really want to try and stay home if you can. Not if you can, you should stay home if you are ill, especially with flu, because flu is just so easily transmissible. And then there may be other staff policy issues. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but if you have I'm blanking on it. Let me go on, because I'll cover it again in a little bit. Sorry about that. So next, you want to consider a communications plan. So this is, obviously we have communications plans for regular disasters, and I would suggest that you have specific ones designated for pandemic as well. So just a couple templates that you draw up in advance when you're clear thinking. You don't want to create a template, or you don't want to create a communications email or whatever whatever methodology you use in the heat of the battle. So you really want to create it in advance. Consider legal issues. If you have unions, that's what I was trying to think of before. If you have unions, you might want to work out something with them so that in a disaster, a different set of rules apply. And sometimes people think it's hard dealing with unions unions, but it shouldn't be if everybody has the same goal and objective of trying to get through this disaster, then hopefully you can work different things out, exceptions to the rules when it comes to unions. So the other thing with regard to legal issues is if you do let some people work from home, you have to make sure that you have a rational basis for doing it. You don't want to just pick certain people to work from home because somebody may claim that they were discriminated against, and not allowed to work from home, and that impacts their family life. So it should be everybody that is in, finance can work from home, not just a few people, but, pick a rational reason for saying that certain people can work from home to avoid any legal complications from that. Addressing IT solutions and limitations. So if you do work from home, then you want to make sure that that you have the technology available within your company to allow lots of people to work from home. So that might involve creating additional, or providing additional ports on your servers to make sure that people don't kind of call in and get a busy signal and can't work from home. We'll talk about the work from home policies in a little bit, so I'm not going to address that now. Ensure employee personal preparedness. So one of the things that I did, and it's down at the bottom, there are educational opportunities, and the Red Cross a few years ago was doing this, where they'd come out and they would train all your employees on how to deal with things like a pandemic. So the types of things that they should kind of stockpile at their house to be prepared for a pandemic. And so the local health departments will probably come out and do something like that. There's other health nonprofits that would also, either hold education seminars or come into your business and work with you to help you out and determine what employees can do to make sure they're personally prepared for a pandemic. Because one of the things that we know is that if employees are worried about their families, you've basically lost them at work. So as much as you can get them and their family prepared, they're going to be more effective workers for you. Okay, workplace modification opportunities. So we talked a little bit about spacing out cubicles or desks. You might want to make sure that there's cleaning available, that there's hand sanitizer available throughout the buildings. A lot of buildings are doing that already, and that's a great thing for seasonal flu. But it would also help during a pandemic. And then take advantage of educational opportunities in your community. We've already touched on that a little bit. So here's where I wanted to go into a telework plan. So this is actually something a friend of mine developed. And, telework or remote work or working from home, it's all basically the same thing. And there's ways to do it that can be effective if you just let everybody work from home periodically. And don't have a good plan for it, then you don't know that you're getting the most use out of it. So some people, for example, some companies require a person to actually take a picture of their home office, the space they have designated where they are going to work from home, and send it into the company as evidence that they've got designated space where they can kind of call their own, get away from the kids and the dogs, and that is their workspace. So you want to make sure that you have certain locations available. The security is still as important if you're working from home. So you can't relax security on a laptop or a PC just because someone's working from home. You still have to be as secure as if you were sitting at the desk. So you have to make sure that they have the right security software on their equipment. You want to make sure that you're limiting liability. So if somebody, for example, and this is a good reason to take a picture of a workspace. Let's say somebody is working in their bed and they walk around and they hurt themselves. They trip over something. Well, they were working, so is that, and you've authorized them to work from home, so is that something that an employer is liable for? It's just something you have to kind of explore and make sure that's one reason to designate a certain workspace, because then if they're working outside their workspace in their home, then maybe you're not liable. For technology requirements, you want to make sure, what if somebody has shaky connectivity where they're not, they're just having an issue. Maybe their Maybe they live a little out in the country where they don't have as good reception or internet connectivity. Is that something that you would accept? So who owns the equipment? Do you own the equipment, or are you asking them to use their equipment? How are your backups going to work? Because if somebody's working remotely, they still potentially have valuable data that you want to make sure is backed up. And then there's cybersecurity, so making sure that all the security systems are up and running. Okay. Oh, just so one other thing about before I move on from that. One of the big issues with remote work, if someone works remotely consistently, is how does a manager maintain a great relationship? How does a team maintain a great relationship if everybody's working remotely? And so there's actually training that you can seek out that would help managers with remote work capabilities and making sure that they're maintaining a good relationship with their employees and that they're managing them effectively, setting goals, those types of things. So you just want to make sure that they're getting the best support they can if they're working remotely, and that your management team doesn't lose touch with them. Okay, so now we're going to start just a couple of slides, and I'm going to try and finish up in the next 2 or 3 minutes with what you can do in your community. So the community should have a plan. When we developed the organization pandemicprep.org here in St. Louis, it was just 3 or 4 guys. Most of us were business continuity people. And we said, we learned about pandemic in 2006 because there were a lot of road shows that the federal and state governments were putting on. And so we said, well, what now? Now that we know about this. So Pandemic Prep is an organization that just shares a lot of information. We actually had a session this morning. And so you want to know what public health is going to do, what rules they're going to institute during a pandemic that will impact your business, and they probably will develop some of those. So you want to understand what those would be. And so when I say develop a plan for the community, that's making sure that health departments are sharing with businesses, with educational institutions, knowing what the hospitals are going to be doing. Are they going to be open for business, or are they going to be are they going to be taking the pandemic patients, or are they not going to be taking the pandemic patients? Developing, talking about when schools need to be closed is an important issue. So understand when public health is going to close the schools, and how is that going to impact your employees? Do they have to, are they going to have to stay home to deal with their kids, or do they have somebody else to watch them? Some businesses are more likely to have men and women of childbearing years that will be more impacted by something like a school closing. So you just need to figure that out, how it's going to impact you. Developing a communications plan for how the community is going to hear about what the rules, are during a severe pandemic. What are the utilities planning? What is other critical infrastructure planning in terms of how will they be impacted, and will services be impacted if they have 30 to 40% less people at their staff? And that includes police and fire and trash pickup. So trash pickup sounds like an odd thing to put there, but New York City, when the trash workers went on strike, found out how difficult life was when no trash was being picked up. It significantly increased rats and other insects, which significantly increased number of illnesses. So it did have a significant impact. And then you might want to talk to other state and local agencies to coordinate responses, so everybody's moving in one in unison together. Okay. Just a couple slides. These are back from 1918. This one is Centellas in Sydney, New South Wales, where they're obviously concerned about spreading disease. And then here's some police officers in Seattle that were all wearing masks as well. And then one more. This is actually a courtroom that's in session, and they decided to move it outdoors because they felt, indoors was too constrained. Now they're still standing too close together, but the outdoors does have a better impact on not spreading the virus nearly as much. So that's just something that they chose to do back in 1918. I'm not sure if it worked that well because people were still standing too close together, but but that was their effort to deal with the pandemic. And that's all I've got. So we have, I think, a few minutes for questions. I'll turn it back over to Ed or Michelle.
And we do have some good questions. Thanks, Harlan. That was great. Here we go. How likely are we to have a 1918 type disastrous pandemic, like the pictures we just saw? Of course, they'd be dressed differently.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and the truth is we don't know. It's something we didn't know when the 2009 pandemic, we didn't know before April of that year that it was going to hit. We certainly didn't know it was going to be in Mexico, because all of us that were kind of in the know thought that the next pandemic would be coming out of the Middle East, and that we'd have time, to prepare for it. Instead, this one happened very quickly and spread to the United States very quickly. And so we really don't know. There's a few agents that I had mentioned earlier that we're watching, but we really don't know when the next pandemic is going to happen. And so the Yogi Berra quote that I'm going to paraphrase, it's difficult to predict things, especially about the future. And so it's something that I feel like we just need to be prepared for. And so the more prepared we can be, the less impactful it will be when it happens. I do have some people saying that we may never have a pandemic like 1918 again, because there were some specific circumstances that happened back then. It was spread in many ways through army movement. So as armies moved around, they were carrying the virus with them, and that's not likely to happen again. But there's other experts, and they're both here in St. Louis. I hear both sides that say that it really could happen again anytime, and it really depends on how virulent and how contagious the disease itself decides to be, and that's something out of our control.
Okay, so we'll just stand by for that. Not much we can do about it, prediction-wise. When will or will the vaccine process improve so vaccines can be manufactured quicker?
So good question. They are working on, so right now the vaccines attack, what I talked about, H1N1, hemagglutinin, and neuraminidase is the H and the N. And so there are certain things that attack the outside of the virus. If you think about a piece of broccoli, it's the best way to describe it. So the tree parts, the more green parts is where the current vaccine attacks. And then there's the stem, and the stem is consistent throughout all the H's and all the N's. And so they're trying to develop a vaccine that would attack the stem so that they could use one vaccine, basically a universal flu vaccine that could attack the stems, and therefore it would be universally available. So it would be available much, much faster. Basically, as soon as there was an influenza pandemic, then they could start using the medicine. So that's what they're trying to get to. And it might take 5 to 10 years for them to get to that point where we're efficient enough that we can have a much stronger and much faster and still safe vaccine. So that's what they're shooting for. And there's probably other methodologies too, but that's one I've heard of that is very promising.
Very good. I think we got time for one more quick one. One of the questions that came in relates to this, so I'm going to use that one. And if there's others that I don't get to, that we don't get to, or that haven't come in yet, we'll get those to you, Harlan, and then we can get a response to the person that asked it. But this one relates to the vaccine process. And they use eggs in the manufacturing process. There's an egg shortage, liquid egg shortage right now because of the 48 or 50 million birds that chickens that had to be killed because of the or died because of the avian flu outbreak, which is pretty much over at this point. Is that I just had the question was, will it affect vaccine production? I think I know the answer because I'm scheduled to get my vaccine next week, and there's no shortage of the vaccine. But and they're supposed to be back up to full production of eggs by January. But any insight on that?
Not really. Just first of all, it's good that you're scheduling your vaccine appointment. I encourage everybody to do that. There has been an egg shortage. I don't know if that's impacted the production of current vaccine. I think the one thing to keep in mind is that during a pandemic, it's sort of like all bets are off, because there's going to be, there's 7 billion people in the world. Most of them will be clamoring for vaccine if it's a severe pandemic, and we won't have 7 billion courses or doses of the vaccine. So if there were a severe pandemic, you would want to get your vaccination as quickly as possible, because at some point it will run out, no question. And they will probably prioritize. I know in 2009, when the vaccine came out, they prioritized pregnant women and children under a certain age first, and first responders got it first, and the hospital staff got it first. Those types of people that are going to be part of the response. And so it wasn't necessarily available to everybody who wanted it initially. And then we found out that it was a very muted virus, and so by let's say November, people didn't really want it because they didn't see a need to get it, because people weren't dying from this. So, but I don't know that really answered your question. I feel like there will be enough eggs to do a normal seasonal flu, but if you're talking about pandemic, I feel like there will be a shortage, because all bets will be off, because the demand will be so high. It'll just go through the roof. That's the problem I see, as long as they're using that same methodology.
And in fact, probably the constricting factor won't be the eggs at that point. It'll be just, the entire manufacturing process, I would think.
The process.
Yeah. Well, all right, we got another one that came in. It's pretty quickie. Who do you consider to be the authoritative source for pandemic information, WHO or CDC?
Well, in the U.S., I think it's the CDC, because I think the the WHO is responsible worldwide, but the CDC is going to, different parts of the world may have to respond differently depending on where it is and how it's impacting society there. So I would say we should be listening more to the CDC than to the World Health Organization. I mean, they're both good sources, so it's hard to choose between them, but because we're in the United States, I would say the CDC will be well up on it. They go around the world along with WHO, so they'll be as up to speed on it as WHO is. And hopefully they'd both be saying the same thing. If they weren't saying the same thing, I'd be worried.
Yeah, right. I think they do check. They probably talk to each other all the time, I would think, especially if something's going on. Okay. Well, Harlan, thank you so much. And thank you all for attending today's program and webinar. And I hope you stay online for just about 30 more seconds for some information that I know you'll find valuable. For that, again, I want to thank you, Harlan. Great presentation. And I'd also like to again thank ADG and their webinar experts for their support of our series. And thanks once again to Continuity Housing for sponsoring the entire ACP webinar series. And remember to visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment in the survey if you're interested in how they can provide your critical employees guaranteed housing when they need it the most. Be sure to watch the ACP website for future webinar information, as well as your email. And as a reminder, this and previous webinars are recorded, made available on the ACP website. Feel free to share the link with peers, anyone that you think might benefit from it. You'll receive a link to the recording right after the webinar via email, along with additional information on the topical content. And finally, a very brief survey about the survey will pop up when you close your browser. Please take half a minute to answer the questions. Again, it really helps us refine our productions for you. Same thing with giving us some topics. Thank you, and have a great day.